In the shadowy corridors of 17th-century Spanish palaces, where power and cruelty danced hand in hand, there lived a child whose very existence became a testament to humanity's capacity for both wonder and horror. Her name was Eugenia Martínez Vallejo, but history would remember her by a different title, one that would strip away her humanity and reduce her to a mere spectacle. They called her La Monstrua, the monster. This is not a tale of supernatural creatures or mythical beasts, but something far more disturbing. The true story of how a society transformed a vulnerable child into entertainment, how medical ignorance became cruelty, and how the pursuit of royal amusement could destroy an innocent life. Eugenia's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how we treat those who are different, and how easily dignity can be sacrificed on the altar of power and entertainment. Born into a world that would never understand her condition, Eugenia would become both a victim and an unwitting symbol of the Spanish Habsburg court's darkest traditions. Her brief life, lasting only 25 years, would be immortalized in two haunting portraits that survive to this day, serving as silent witnesses to a cruelty that spanned generations. The year was 1674, and in the remote villages of northern Spain, medical knowledge remained shrouded in superstition and ignorance. What we now recognize as Prader-Willi syndrome, a genetic disorder causing insatiable hunger and rapid weight gain, was then seen as either divine punishment or a miraculous oddity. For little Eugenia, this meant her body would become her prison and her difference would become her curse. But this story transcends the tale of one girl's suffering. It reveals the systematic exploitation of the disabled and different by Europe's most powerful monarchy, exposing a world where human beings were collected like exotic animals for the amusement of kings. Eugenia's life would illuminate the darkest corners of Spanish royal culture, where cruelty masqueraded as curiosity and where a child's pain became a court's pleasure. The Spanish Empire of the 17th century stood as one of the most powerful forces in the world, yet beneath its golden facade lay a realm plagued by decay, superstition, and an obsession with the grotesque. King Charles II, known as El Hechizado, or the Bewitched, ruled over this crumbling empire with a court that reflected his own physical and mental afflictions, the result of generations of royal inbreeding. In this world of declining power and increasing paranoia, the Spanish nobility had developed a peculiar fascination with what they called human curiosities. The royal courts of the 16th and 17th centuries deliberately collected individuals with physical differences, mental disabilities, and unusual conditions. These people were not seen as individuals deserving of dignity and care, but as living ornaments designed to enhance the perceived beauty and normalcy of their aristocratic masters. The practice had deep roots in European court culture, where the contrast principle ruled supreme. By surrounding themselves with those deemed ugly or monstrous, the nobility believed their own beauty and refinement would shine more brightly. This wasn't merely casual entertainment. It was a calculated system of dehumanization that served to reinforce social hierarchies and royal power. These unfortunate individuals were officially known as gente de placer, people of pleasure, or more cruelly, sabandijas del palacio, vermin of the palace. They lived in a strange limbo, neither servants nor guests, neither fully human nor completely objects. They were fed and housed, but never paid. They were displayed and celebrated, but never respected. They existed solely for the amusement of those who held power over life and death. The Spanish court under Charles II was particularly notorious for this practice. Historical records show that Philip IV, Charles's predecessor, maintained a collection of approximately 110 people with dwarfism alone in the royal household. These individuals were expected to perform, to entertain, and most importantly, to remind the nobility of their own perceived superiority. It was into this world of systematic exploitation that young Eugenia would be thrust, becoming perhaps the most tragic symbol of this dehumanizing practice. On a quiet Sunday morning in 1674, in the small village of Merindad de Monteja, in the province of Burgos, an extraordinary event unfolded within the sacred walls of the local church. Antonia de la Bodega, heavily pregnant and attending Mass with her husband José Martínez Vallejo, suddenly went into labor during the service. With no time to reach home or find a midwife, She gave birth to her daughter right there on the church floor, surrounded by stunned parishioners and the ancient stones that had witnessed centuries of prayer. The villagers took this unusual birth as a divine sign. Surely this child was destined for something extraordinary. They named her Eugenia, meaning well-born or noble, perhaps hoping that her unusual entrance into the world would translate into a blessed life. How tragically wrong they would prove to be. The very circumstances of her birth, which seemed so miraculous, would later be twisted into evidence of her monstrous nature by those who sought to exploit her condition. In those early months, Eugenia appeared to be a normal, healthy baby. Her appetite was strong and she grew rapidly, traits that were initially celebrated by her family and community. In an era when infant mortality was devastatingly high, a baby who ate well and gained weight was considered blessed. The medical and aesthetic standards of the time actually favored plumper children and women, viewing them as signs of health, fertility, and good fortune. But as the months passed, Eugenia's growth became alarming. By her first birthday, she weighed an astounding 55 pounds, nearly 3 times the weight of a normal 1-year-old. Her parents, simple peasants with no understanding of medical conditions, initially attributed this to God's abundance. Their daughter was clearly special, they reasoned, blessed with an extraordinary constitution that would serve her well in life. However, as Eugenia's weight continued to increase at an unprecedented rate, the family's pride began to transform into worry, then fear, and finally shame. By the time she reached 6 years old, Eugenia weighed 155 pounds, the size of a full-grown adult woman. Her body had become grotesquely disproportionate, her face round and puffy, her movements labored and difficult. The blessed child had become, in the eyes of her community, a living curse. What no one in 17th century Spain could understand was that Eugenia was suffering from Prader-Willi syndrome, a rare genetic disorder that affects the hypothalamus, the part of the brain that controls hunger and satiation. People with this condition experience constant, overwhelming hunger that can never be satisfied. They eat not from gluttony or lack of willpower, but because their brains never receive the signal that they are full. It's a cruel biological trap that condemns its victims to a lifetime of struggle with their own bodies. The syndrome also affects muscle tone, growth patterns, and cognitive development, though Eugenia appears to have retained her mental faculties relatively intact. Contemporary accounts describe her as having a pleasant personality and a beautiful face, despite her physical condition. But in an age when such disorders were attributed to divine punishment, demonic possession, or moral failings, Eugenia found herself increasingly isolated and misunderstood. As her condition worsened, the neighbors who had once celebrated her birth began to whisper and point. Children who had played with her now ran away in fear or laughed at her appearance. The village that had seen her unusual birth as a miracle now viewed her transformation as a curse. Her parents, overwhelmed by shame and unable to explain their daughter's condition, began to hide her away from public view, keeping her confined to their humble home. The family desperately sought help from local physicians and religious figures, but 17th century medicine had no answers for Eugenia's condition. Doctors prescribed various treatments, strict diets, bloodletting, prayers, and potions, but nothing could stop her body's relentless expansion. Each failed remedy only deepened the family's despair and the community's conviction that something supernatural was at work. In their desperation, Jose and Antonia consulted traveling physicians, folk healers, and priests, spending what little money they had on increasingly bizarre treatments. Some suggested that Eugenia was possessed by demons of gluttony. Others claimed she had been cursed by envious neighbors. A few even whispered that she might be a changeling, a monster left by fairies in place of their real daughter. Each consultation brought new humiliation and no relief, driving the family deeper into isolation and poverty. By 1680, when Eugenia was 6 years old, her condition had become so extreme that word of the giant child began to spread beyond their small village. Traveling merchants, pilgrims, and officials carried tales of the extraordinary girl back to their home regions, and eventually, these stories reached the ears of the royal court in Madrid. In an era when communication was slow and unreliable, the fact that news of Eugenia traveled over 200 miles to reach the king speaks to just how shocking her appearance had become. King Charles II, already known for his collection of human curiosities, was immediately intrigued by reports of this remarkable child. His court was always hungry for new spectacles, new wonders to display at royal gatherings and foreign diplomatic events. The king's advisors painted a picture of Eugenia not as a suffering child, but as a rare treasure that could bring glory and wonder to the royal household. The summons came in the form of a royal decree that the Martínez family could not refuse. Eugenia was to be brought to Madrid immediately to join the court of His Catholic Majesty. For her parents, this royal command was both a blessing and a curse. It offered an escape from their village's cruelty and the promise of better care for their daughter, but it also meant surrendering her to a world they could never hope to understand or influence. The journey from Burgos to Madrid was an ordeal that would mark the end of Eugenia's childhood and the beginning of her life as a living exhibition. Traveling over rough roads in a specially reinforced cart, she endured the stares, whispers, and pointing fingers of everyone she encountered along the way. Each stop became an impromptu spectacle as word spread quickly through towns and villages that the monster child was passing through. When Eugenia finally arrived at the Royal Alcázar in Madrid, she entered a world unlike anything she could have imagined. The opulent palace with its endless corridors, golden furnishings, and army of servants must have seemed like a fairy tale to a girl who had spent her early years in a simple peasant dwelling. But this golden cage would prove to be more prison than palace, a place where her humanity would be slowly stripped away in favor of her value as entertainment. The 6-year-old Eugenia was immediately presented to King Charles II, who was reportedly delighted by her appearance. Contemporary accounts describe how the king himself bestowed upon her the nickname that would follow her for the rest of her short life: La Monstrua, the monster. This was not said with malice, but with the casual cruelty of someone who had never learned to see disabled people as fully human. To Charles II, Eugenia was a fascinating acquisition, like a rare animal or precious jewel. The royal tailor was immediately commissioned to create special garments for Eugenia, transforming her from a peasant child into a courtly spectacle. She was dressed in sumptuous gowns of red and white brocade, adorned with silver buttons and fine lace that would have cost more than her family's annual income. These beautiful clothes served a dual purpose. They made her appearance even more striking and unusual, while also marking her as property of the crown. Eugenia was assigned quarters within the palace complex, though her living conditions reflected her status as something between a pet and a performer. She was well fed. Indeed, her constant hunger was indulged to an extent that would have been impossible for her peasant family to provide. The royal kitchens provided her with endless supplies of bread, meat, sweets, and delicacies that only worsened her condition while keeping her docile and dependent on royal generosity. Her daily routine revolved entirely around her role as entertainment. She was brought out for court gatherings, diplomatic receptions, and royal parties, where nobles would marvel at her size and comment on her condition as if she were an exotic animal. Ladies of the court particularly enjoyed being portrayed alongside her, as the contrast emphasized their own slender figures and conventional beauty. Eugenia had become a living prop in the theater of royal vanity. The court physician, Dr. Juan Cabezas, even published a pamphlet about Eugenia in 1680 titled "True Account of the Prodigies of Nature That Have Arrived at This Court." In this document, he described her not as a suffering child, but as a miracle of nature sent by God for the amazement and delight of the royal household. The pamphlet was distributed throughout Spain and beyond, turning Eugenia into a celebrity of sorts, though one defined entirely by her physical condition rather than her personality or humanity. But perhaps the most profound violation of Eugenia's dignity came through the artistic legacy that would immortalize her suffering. King Charles II, fascinated by his new acquisition, commissioned the court painter Juan Carreño de Miranda to create portraits of La Monstrua. Carreño, already established as one of Spain's most skilled portraitists, was instructed to capture Eugenia in two very different states, clothed in her royal finery and completely nude. The resulting paintings, completed around 1680, are among the most disturbing and complex works in Spanish art history. Titled La Monstrua Vestida, the monster clothed, and La Monstrua Desnuda, the monster nude. These portraits have survived for over 3 centuries as silent witnesses to the cruelty and exploitation that defined Eugenia's existence at court. In the clothed portrait, Eugenia appears dressed in her elaborate red and white gown, her small hands delicately positioned in a pose that might have been appropriate for any noble child of the era. But her expression, captured with brutal honesty by Carreño, tells a different story. Her eyes reflect a profound sadness, a weariness that should never be seen in a child's face. She appears to understand on some level that she is being displayed rather than honored, used rather than celebrated. The nude portrait is even more disturbing, as it strips away not only Eugenia's clothing, but any pretense of treating her with dignity. Posed like a classical figure, she holds grapes in her hand, a reference to Bacchus, the Roman god of wine and excess. This artistic choice transforms her from a suffering child into a mythological creature, further dehumanizing her condition by suggesting that her obesity represents indulgence rather than illness. Art historians have debated these paintings for centuries. Some argue that Carreño painted Eugenia with remarkable dignity, capturing her humanity despite the circumstances. Others contend that the very existence of these portraits, particularly the nude, represents one of the most exploitative acts in art history. The truth likely lies somewhere between these extremes. Carreño was a skilled artist working within the constraints of a royal commission, trying to balance honest portrayal with the expectations of his patron. What cannot be debated is the impact these paintings had on Eugenia's life and legacy. They turned her into an object of artistic study, a subject to be analyzed and discussed by people who would never know her as a person. The paintings traveled throughout Europe, carrying her image to foreign courts, where she became synonymous with Spanish royal excess and cruelty. Long after her death, these portraits would ensure that she was remembered not as Eugenia the child, but as La Monstrua, the monster. Life at the Spanish court during the reign of Charles II was a daily performance of power, vanity, and casual cruelty, and Eugenia found herself at the center of this theatrical world. Her existence followed a rigid routine designed entirely around the entertainment needs of the nobility. Each morning, she would be dressed by servants in one of her elaborate gowns, her hair arranged, and her face painted to maximize the visual impact of her condition when presented to visitors. The palace courtiers developed a particular fascination with using Eugenia as a measuring stick for their own beauty and refinement. Noble ladies would specifically request to be painted alongside her, knowing that the contrast would make them appear more delicate and desirable. These sessions were not private affairs, but public spectacles, with crowds of nobles gathering to comment on the stark differences between conventional beauty and Eugenia's altered form. Diplomatic visits provided some of the most humiliating experiences for Eugenia, as foreign ambassadors and dignitaries were invariably presented with the court's collection of human curiosities as part of the standard entertainment program. She would be brought into ornate reception halls like a piece of furniture, expected to remain silent and still, while visitors examined her, discussed her condition, and marveled at her size. These encounters reduced her to the status of a museum exhibit, valuable for what she represented rather than who she was. The psychological toll of this existence can only be imagined. Contemporary accounts suggest that Eugenia retained her mental faculties and was described as having a pleasant personality, despite her circumstances. Some courtiers noted that she seemed to enjoy the attention and fine food provided by her royal patrons. However, these observations come from people who had never considered her perspective or emotional well-being, viewing her contentment through the lens of their own assumptions about what someone in her position should feel. The few glimpses we have of Eugenia's inner life come through a careful examination of Carreño's portraits, particularly the profound sadness visible in her eyes. Modern psychological analysis of these paintings suggests a child who understood her situation far better than her handlers realized. The weight of constant observation, the knowledge that her value lay entirely in her difference, and the isolation from normal childhood experiences all contributed to what must have been a profoundly lonely existence, despite being surrounded by people at all times. The court's treatment of Eugenia reflected broader attitudes toward disability and difference in 17th century Europe. Medical understanding of genetic conditions was virtually non-existent, and physical abnormalities were typically interpreted through religious or supernatural frameworks. The concept of Prader-Willi syndrome wouldn't be identified until the 1950s, meaning that Eugenia's condition was seen as either divine punishment, demonic influence, or simply an inexplicable curiosity of nature. This ignorance had profound implications for how Eugenia was treated. Rather than receiving medical care aimed at managing her condition, she was indulged in ways that actively worsened her health. The royal kitchens provided her with unlimited access to rich foods, sweets, and delicacies that would have been impossible for her family to afford. While this seemed like royal generosity, it actually accelerated her weight gain and physical deterioration. The court physicians who examined Eugenia were more interested in documenting her condition than treating it. Dr. Juan Cabezas, who published the famous pamphlet about her, approached her case from a perspective of wonder rather than medical concern. His writings describe her measurements, her appetite, and her behavior in clinical detail, but show no evidence of any attempt to understand the underlying cause of her condition or develop treatments that might improve her quality of life. This medical neglect was compounded by the social isolation that came with her role as court entertainment. While surrounded by people, Eugenia had no real relationships or genuine human connections. She was not educated like other children, not given opportunities to develop friendships, and not prepared for any kind of independent life. Her existence was entirely dependent on royal favor and the continued entertainment value of her condition. The psychological impact of this treatment would have been devastating for any child, but particularly for one dealing with the additional challenges of Prader-Willi syndrome. People with this condition often struggle with behavioral issues related to their constant hunger and frustration with their inability to control their eating. In an environment where her overeating was encouraged rather than managed, and where her emotional needs were completely ignored, Eugenia faced an almost impossible psychological burden. As the years passed, Eugenia's role at court began to evolve in subtle but significant ways. Initially brought to Madrid as a 6-year-old curiosity, she gradually became a permanent fixture of royal entertainment, her presence so expected that foreign visitors specifically requested to see La Monstrua during their diplomatic visits. This familiarity bred a kind of casual affection among some courtiers who began to view her less as a spectacle and more as a beloved if unusual member of the palace household. However, this evolution was double-edged. While some nobles developed a genuine fondness for Eugenia, treating her with kindness and ensuring her comfort, this affection was still rooted in her role as entertainment rather than a recognition of her full humanity. She became something like a cherished pet, loved for her uniqueness and loyalty, but never truly seen as an equal or independent being with her own desires and aspirations. The court's treatment of Eugenia also reflected the broader dynamics of Spanish royal culture during this period. King Charles II himself was physically and mentally disabled due to generations of royal inbreeding, creating a court where disability and difference were simultaneously stigmatized and normalized. The king's own limitations made him perhaps more tolerant of others with physical challenges, but also more likely to view them through the lens of his own experience of being valued despite, rather than for, his personal qualities. Palace records from this period suggest that Eugenia developed particular relationships with certain members of the royal household. Some accounts mention her fondness for specific courtiers who showed her kindness and her apparent pleasure in certain court activities, like musical performances or religious ceremonies. These glimpses of personal preference and emotional response hint at a rich inner life that was largely ignored by those around her. But as Eugenia entered her teenage years, new challenges emerged. Her continued weight gain made movement increasingly difficult, and her health began to show signs of deterioration. The constant strain on her heart, joints, and other organs, consequences of Prader-Willi syndrome that were completely unknown to 17th century medicine, began to take their toll. What had once been seen as an amusing miracle of nature was becoming a medical tragedy that the court was utterly unprepared to address. By the 1690s, as Eugenia entered her 20s, the novelty of her presence at court had begun to fade. New curiosities and entertainments captured royal attention, and the woman who had once been the center of palace spectacles found herself increasingly relegated to the margins of court life. The same condition that had made her valuable as a child was now making her a burden as an adult. Her health problems and limited mobility reduced her entertainment value. The lack of contemporary records about Eugenia's final years speaks volumes about how her status at court had diminished. Where once every aspect of her condition was documented and discussed, the last decade of her life passed with little official notice. She continued to live in the palace, continued to receive food and basic care, but the attention and fascination that had defined her existence since childhood had largely evaporated. This neglect was particularly cruel, given that Eugenia would have been experiencing the full impact of her medical condition during these years. Prader-Willi syndrome typically leads to serious health complications in early adulthood, including diabetes, heart problems, respiratory issues, and joint deterioration. Without proper medical care or understanding of her condition, Eugenia faced these challenges essentially alone, her suffering invisible to a court that had lost interest in her story. The few accounts that survive from this period suggest that Eugenia maintained her pleasant demeanor despite her declining health and reduced circumstances. Some courtiers noted her continued presence at religious services and her apparent contentment with simple pleasures like music and food. However, these observations come from people who had never been equipped to understand the complex emotional and physical needs of someone in her situation. Perhaps most tragically, there is no evidence that anyone at court ever considered what Eugenia might want for her own life or future. She had spent nearly 2 decades as a royal possession, valued for her difference but never consulted about her own desires or aspirations. As her health declined and her entertainment value diminished, she faced the prospect of an uncertain future with no skills, education, or support system beyond the increasingly indifferent royal household. The exact circumstances of Eugenia's death remain shrouded in the same casual indifference that marked her final years at court. Historical records suggest she died around 1699 at approximately 25 years of age, but the specific cause of death was either not recorded or has been lost to time. This lack of documentation stands in stark contrast to the detailed accounts of her arrival at court and early years as a royal curiosity, highlighting how thoroughly her value as a person had diminished once her entertainment worth expired. What we do know about her death comes primarily from palace inventory records that noted the return of her clothing and personal effects to royal storage. These bureaucratic documents list her elaborate gowns, jewelry, and other possessions with the same impersonal precision used for any other palace property, treating the remnants of her life as mere objects to be catalogued and stored. The woman who had once been the center of court attention was reduced in death to a list of material goods. The likely cause of Eugenia's relatively early death would have been complications related to her Prader-Willi syndrome. Though this could not have been understood at the time, people with this condition often develop serious health problems in early adulthood, including cardiovascular disease, diabetes, respiratory failure, and complications from obesity. Given the complete lack of medical understanding or appropriate treatment during her lifetime, it's remarkable that Eugenia survived as long as she did. Her death appears to have caused little stir at the Spanish court, which had moved on to new entertainments and spectacles. There are no records of funeral arrangements, mourning rituals, or expressions of grief from the courtiers who had known her for nearly 2 decades. This silence speaks to the fundamental dehumanization that had defined her entire adult life. She had been valuable as entertainment, but her passing was not mourned as the loss of a person. The casual dismissal of Eugenia's death reflects the broader attitudes toward disability and difference that characterized her era. Having served her purpose as a living curiosity, her death was seen as the natural end of a spectacle rather than the loss of a human being with intrinsic worth and dignity. The court that had made her famous showed no interest in commemorating her life or acknowledging the ways in which they had exploited her condition for their own amusement. In the centuries following Eugenia's death, her story was largely forgotten, except as a footnote in art history discussions of Carreño's portraits. The paintings that had immortalized her suffering continued to hang in royal collections, viewed by subsequent generations who saw them primarily as examples of Spanish Baroque portraiture, rather than documents of human exploitation. The woman behind the images, her personality, her suffering, her brief moments of joy, faded from memory, leaving only the artistic representations that had reduced her to a symbol rather than a person. It wasn't until the late 20th century that scholars began to re-examine Eugenia's story, with a modern understanding of both her medical condition and the broader historical context of disability exploitation. Medical historians recognize the clear symptoms of Prader-Willi syndrome in contemporary descriptions of her condition, while social historians began to place her experience within the larger framework of how European courts treated people with disabilities as entertainment objects. This renewed scholarly interest led to a gradual rehabilitation of Eugenia's memory, with researchers working to restore her humanity and dignity after centuries of being remembered primarily as La Monstrua. Art historians began to reinterpret Carreño's portraits not as celebrations of royal power over the unusual, but as complex documents of exploitation that reveal more about their commissioners than their subject. Social historians used her story to illuminate the broader patterns of disability discrimination and exploitation that characterized early modern European society. The most significant step in this rehabilitation came in 1997, when the city of Avilés, Spain, birthplace of the painter Juan Carreño de Miranda, erected a bronze statue of Eugenia based on her clothed portrait. This monument represented a remarkable shift in how her story was understood and remembered. Rather than celebrating the artist or the royal court that had exploited her, the statue stands as a memorial to Eugenia herself, acknowledging her dignity and humanity centuries after her death. The statue includes a small detail not present in the original paintings: a mouse at Eugenia's feet, added by the sculptor Fernando Favila after a mouse wandered through his studio during the creation of the work. This tiny addition has proved popular with locals, who have repeatedly replaced the mouse figure when it was stolen, showing an unexpected emotional connection to this memorial of a long-dead woman who suffered so far from their modern world. The placement of this statue on a street named for Carreño de Miranda creates a complex dialogue between artist and subject, perpetrator and victim. Visitors to the memorial are confronted not only with Eugenia's image, but with questions about the role of art in documenting and perpetuating exploitation. The statue forces viewers to consider their own complicity in systems that reduce human beings to their most visible differences, and challenges them to see dignity where previous generations saw only curiosity. Eugenia Martínez Vallejo's story resonates powerfully in our contemporary world, where people with disabilities and differences continue to face discrimination, exploitation, and dehumanization. While the specific cruelties of the Spanish royal court may seem like relics of a barbaric past, the underlying attitudes that enabled her exploitation persist in more subtle forms throughout modern society. The tendency to view people with disabilities as sources of inspiration, pity, or entertainment, rather than as full human beings with their own agency and desires, echoes the court's treatment of Eugenia. Modern inspiration porn, the practice of highlighting disabled people's achievements primarily to make able-bodied people feel good about themselves, shares disturbing parallels with the way 17th century nobles used Eugenia to enhance their own sense of normalcy and beauty. Similarly, the medical establishment's historical failure to understand and treat Eugenia's condition reflects ongoing challenges in healthcare for people with rare diseases and complex conditions. The centuries that passed between Eugenia's death and the identification of Prader-Willi syndrome remind us that medical ignorance can be as destructive as deliberate cruelty, and that the absence of knowledge is not an excuse for the absence of compassion. The artistic legacy of Carreño's portraits raises complex questions about representation, consent, and the ethics of displaying images of vulnerable people. These paintings continue to be exhibited in major museums, viewed by millions of people who may or may not understand the circumstances of their creation. The ongoing display of these works, particularly the nude portrait, forces us to confront our own role as viewers in perpetuating the objectification that defined Eugenia's life. Her story also illuminates the intersection of poverty, disability, and social class that continues to shape the experiences of vulnerable people today. Eugenia's fate was sealed not only by her medical condition, but by her family's poverty and lack of social power. Their inability to refuse the royal summons, to advocate for their daughter's well-being, or to provide alternative care options reflects the ways in which socioeconomic inequality compounds the challenges faced by people with disabilities across all historical periods. The transformation of Eugenia from curiosity to beloved figure, to forgotten person, to renewed symbol, demonstrates how the value assigned to human lives can shift dramatically based on social attitudes, political priorities, and cultural trends. Her posthumous rehabilitation as a symbol of dignity and resilience shows both the power of historical revision and the ongoing responsibility to examine past injustices with more enlightened perspectives. Most importantly, Eugenia's life reminds us that every person, regardless of their physical or cognitive differences, possesses inherent dignity and worth that cannot be diminished by their utility to others. The tragedy of her story lies not in her medical condition, but in a society's failure to recognize her fundamental humanity beyond her most visible characteristics. As we reflect on Eugenia Martínez Vallejo's brief and tragic life, we are confronted with uncomfortable truths about human nature, social power, and the ways in which difference has been weaponized throughout history. Her story serves as a mirror, reflecting not only the cruelties of 17th-century Spanish court culture, but also the ongoing challenges faced by vulnerable people in every era, including our own. The 25 years of Eugenia's existence encapsulate some of humanity's darkest impulses: the reduction of complex individuals to their most visible traits, the exploitation of vulnerability for entertainment, and the casual cruelty that emerges when power encounters powerlessness. Yet her story also demonstrates the resilience of human dignity, which somehow survived decades of dehumanization and continues to inspire recognition and respect centuries after her death. The memorial statue in Aviles stands as more than just a tribute to one forgotten woman. It represents a collective acknowledgement of historical wrongs and a commitment to remembering the victims of institutional cruelty. But memorialization alone is insufficient if we fail to examine how the attitudes that enabled Eugenia's exploitation continue to manifest in contemporary society. The questions raised by her life remain urgently relevant. How do we balance scientific curiosity with human dignity? What responsibilities do artists, entertainers, and media producers have when depicting vulnerable people? How can societies provide care and support for people with disabilities without reducing them to objects of pity or inspiration? What safeguards exist to prevent the powerful from exploiting those who cannot advocate for themselves? Perhaps most importantly, Eugenia's story challenges us to examine our own assumptions about normalcy, beauty, and human worth. The Spanish courtiers who called her La Monstrua were not uniquely evil. They were products of a system that taught them to view certain types of difference as inherently inferior or amusing. We must ask ourselves what systems of thinking and social organization in our own time might be teaching us similar lessons, and how we can resist the impulse to define human value by proximity to arbitrary standards of normalcy. In the end, the girl who was called a monster by royalty reveals the true monsters to be those who stripped her of dignity in pursuit of their own entertainment. Eugenia Martínez Vallejo deserves to be remembered not as a curiosity or a victim, but as a person whose life, however constrained and exploited, possessed the same inherent worth as any other. Her legacy challenges us to build a world where no child's difference becomes their prison, and where every person's humanity is recognized regardless of their utility to others. The bronze statue in Aviles will weather and age, but the question Eugenia's life raises about dignity, difference, and the responsibilities of power will endure as long as human society struggles with the challenge of treating all people as fully human.